There's an old saying in geopolitics, alliances are born out of fear, not friendship. In the modern world order, few fears run as deep in Washington as the silent but steady convergence of three powers, Russia, India, and China. For decades, each of these nations has charted its own course, often conflicting, occasionally overlapping. But now, beneath the surface of diplomatic formalities and economic forums, a triangle of convenience is emerging, one that has the potential to quietly disrupt the very structure of the global system the United States helped create after World War II. Washington's real concern is not a formal alliance or military pact. The U.S. doesn't expect Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi to sign a treaty tomorrow. What truly unsettles American strategists is the possibility of economic coordination. Three of the world's largest markets, resource bases, and production centers, quietly realigning to sidestep Western systems, weaken the dollar, bypass sanctions, and reshape global trade routes. This is the great disruption. Not a war, but an erosion of control. Not a declaration, but a silent drift. Let's start with Russia. Sanctioned, isolated, and cut off from Western finance, Moscow has found itself leaning ever more heavily on Asia. China has been the most obvious partner, buying up discounted oil and gas, investing in infrastructure, and integrating with Russia's digital and financial systems. But what most people miss is the growing, albeit subtler, Russia-India alignment. New Delhi continues to buy Russian oil in massive quantities, often at rates that would make OPEC blush. But it's not just oil. India is quietly strengthening defense ties with Russia, expanding trade in local currencies, and even discussing parallel financial systems to SWIFT. Washington sees this. It watches nervously as Indian refiners process Russian crude and resell it globally. It sees Indian banks slowly accommodating rupee-ruble transactions. It notices that every time the West tries to tighten the noose on Moscow, India becomes one of the pressure valves. And while the U.S. publicly maintains that India is a trusted partner behind closed doors, the frustration is palpable. China, of course, is a different case. The U.S. has already positioned Beijing as the primary rival, economically and militarily. But the idea of China and Russia cooperating isn't new. What's changed is the possibility that India too might be drawn into this axis, not ideologically but pragmatically. The triangle doesn't need to agree on everything. They only need to agree on one thing. The Western order no longer serves their interests. And increasingly, that's exactly what's happening. Take trade settlements. The U.S. dollar has long been the default currency for global trade, but now we see rupee-ruble transactions, yuan-ruble settlements, and even rupee-yuan exchanges quietly gaining ground. India and Russia are experimenting with alternatives. China has launched the digital yuan, positioning it as a cross-border settlement tool. Russia's SPFS, an alternative to SWIFT, is slowly gaining members. Even India is building its own financial rails. It's not that these systems will replace the dollar overnight. They won't. But what they represent is erosion, 1,000 tiny leaks in the dam of dollar dominance, and every one of them reduces Washington's ability to sanction, control, or coerce. This, in Washington's view, is the real threat. Then there's the matter of resources. Russia is a commodity superpower. China is a manufacturing titan. India is a services and consumption giant. Put the three together and you have the raw inputs, the processing power, and the consumer base for a self-contained economic system, one that can rival the West, not through military confrontation, but through economic resilience. It's no surprise then that the U.S. is ramping up efforts to drive wedges between these nations. With China, the strategy is open containment, military alliances, semiconductor bans, diplomatic isolation. With Russia, it's punitive, sanctions, asset seizures, exclusion from SWIFT. But with India, the strategy is persuasion. The U.S. offers technology deals, defense cooperation, and investment incentives. It hosts summits, signs pacts, and flatters Indian ambitions. The goal is simple: keep New Delhi from drifting too far east. But this isn't India is no longer a junior partner looking for aid. It's a rising power that plays multiple games at once. It buys Russian oil, signs defense deals with the US, and negotiates trade agreements with the EU, all in the same breath. It doesn't want to choose, and more importantly, it doesn't have to. That's what scares Washington the most, because the Great Disruption isn't about overt defiance, it's about subtle rebalancing, about nations building quiet alternatives, about the end of monopoly, whether of currency, technology, or diplomacy. India is already building chips with Japan, launching UPI globally, negotiating energy deals with the Gulf, and talking nuclear cooperation with France. It's not turning away from the West, it's simply building optionality, and that's what Washington fears more than anything, the loss of leverage. If India, Russia, and China can operate with independence, trading in local currencies, sharing technologies, building regional infrastructure, they create a world where American approval is no longer the gatekeeper of prosperity. The most powerful tool the U.S. ever had wasn't its military. It was the system built around the dollar, around Western banks, around American tech giants, a system where disobedience came with cost and compliance brought reward. But that system only works if everyone has no choice. The moment real alternatives emerge, the spell breaks, and that moment is closer than most people think. Let's consider the economic implications. If Russia, India, and China formed a true economic triangle, it would encompass over 3 billion people, span the world's largest landmass, and bring together energy, industry, technology, and manpower in a way the world has never seen before. Russia has abundant energy resources, from oil and gas to critical minerals like lithium and rare earths. China brings manufacturing scale, capital, and infrastructure power through Belt and Road, and India adds a booming consumer market, a rising tech sector, and one of the world's largest and youngest workforces. Now imagine a situation where Russia fuels the factories of China, China builds infrastructure across Asia, and India drives demand and innovation. It would create a self-sustaining triangle that doesn't need the West, not for energy, not for technology, and certainly not for validation. This is the nightmare scenario for Washington and Brussels, because such an alliance could undermine the US dollar's dominance, bypass Western-controlled trade networks, and develop alternative institutions to SWIFT, the IMF, and the World Bank, all of which have long served Western interests. And let's not forget, Russia and China have already taken major steps in this direction, using local currencies for trade, building alternate financial systems, and launching BRICS initiatives to challenge Western control over global finance. If India joined them in full, that would be a tipping point. It would give legitimacy to a multipolar economic world, something India has long supported in rhetoric, but avoided in execution, largely due to its delicate balancing act between East and West. So what's stopping India? The truth is, India is cautious. It wants strategic autonomy, not dependency, whether on the US or China. And while New Delhi is happy to cooperate with Moscow, it has deep distrust toward Beijing, given their history of border tensions, trade imbalances, and regional rivalries. Moreover, India's partnership with the US, from defense to digital, has been growing at a rapid pace, so Washington knows it has a narrow window, a window where India hasn't yet fully committed to either side. That's why the US is investing heavily in India's rise, pushing defense cooperation, tech transfers, chip manufacturing, and strategic trade. It's not just goodwill, it's insurance against the triangle, because the day India leans fully into an axis with Russia and China is the day the West loses its grip over Asia's future. And make no mistake, India holds the balance. It is the one power that can swing either way. That's why it's being courted so aggressively by both sides. And that's why the US is doing everything it can to delay or disrupt any true alignment between New Delhi, Moscow, and Beijing. The Great Disruption isn't about tanks or troops.
It's about who gets to shape the next global order, and whether India, Russia, and China choose to do it together. If there's one thing the United States has learned from history, it's this: geopolitics is less about who your friends are, and more about who your enemies befriend. And for Washington, a tightening bond between Moscow, New Delhi, and Beijing is a geostrategic nightmare decades in the making. This fear didn't begin yesterday. It traces back to the Cold War era. Washington has always viewed triangular alliances in Eurasia with deep suspicion, first with the Soviet bloc, then later with the China-Russia axis. But throw India into that triangle, now you're not just talking about a military pact, you're staring down the barrel of an alternative economic world order, the unthinkable triangle. Let's play this out. Russia is still rich in energy and arms, China the world's largest manufacturing hub, and India the fastest growing consumer market with a rising tech sector and youth demographic unmatched by either. If this triangle fully locks in, you're looking at a common alternative to SWIFT payment systems, joint energy infrastructure projects bypassing Western control, a pan-Eurasian trade corridor from Vladivostok to Mumbai, and perhaps most worryingly for the U.S., a collaborative AI chip and space race ecosystem, all outside American regulatory reach. That's not multipolarity anymore. That's de-dollarization, de-Westernization, and de-Americanization, wrapped into one neat Eurasian triangle. No wonder Washington is alarmed. Divide and delay. The U.S. strategy has been consistent. Prevent the triangle from closing. That's why Washington continues to fuel India-China tensions over border disputes through selective diplomatic pressure. Court India with defense deals and Quad initiatives, offering just enough partnership to pull New Delhi westward. Discredit BRICS cooperation by calling it ineffective, even as it expands. Cast suspicion on Russian arms supply chains, trying to make India nervous about relying on Moscow for defense. It's all part of the same playbook. Keep India and China at odds. Keep India suspicious of Russia's growing tilt toward Beijing, and keep the U.S. in India's strategic orbit. India holds the leverage. But here's the reality. India is not playing by Washington's script. Despite the Quad, India hasn't joined anti-Russia sanctions. Despite border skirmishes, India still engages with China economically. Bilateral trade hit a record $136 billion in 2024, even amid rising nationalism. Despite U.S. pressure, India continues to explore joint energy projects with Russia, especially in the Arctic and Far East. India is the wild card, the swing vote in the global order, neither entirely Western nor fully Eastern. And that is exactly why the U.S. fears this triangle so deeply. Because if India ever decides to fully embrace a Eurasian identity, Washington's unipolar dream is officially dead. Not with a bang, but with a handshake in Moscow.